welcome to the Empowered to Connect podcast, where we come together to discuss a healing-centered approach to engagement and well-being for ourselves, our families, and our communities. I'm JD Wilson, and I am the host of this podcast. And let me encourage you, if you missed last week's episode, to go back and check out the announcement that we had at the end of the episode. It is about the Dads Connected coaching program that we are launching at empoweredtoconnect.org. It is an incredible program led by some men that I deeply respect and love. So if you are in need of that, if you're a dad and you are thinking, man, I could use somebody coming alongside and kind of coaching into my life or speaking into my life, or if you've got a group of dads that you meet with regularly and y'all could use some guidance, man, make sure that you check out empoweredtoconnect.org. You can also forward that information on to the dads that you know in your life as well. And if you missed last week's episode, don't just fast forward to the end. Go back and listen to that whole thing, man, because Dan was an incredible guest, Dan Coley, and we loved having him on. Incredible wisdom from him. And he was so fun to get to talk to. So you will love getting to go back and hear that if you haven't already checked it out. Today on the show, we also have an incredible guest, and his name is Troy McPeak. Troy was a worker in the Texas Juvenile Justice System and was an ex-football player. He definitely fit the bill of a typical person working in a juvenile justice facility. Tough guy with a commanding presence who had a great connection with kids, and going through practitioner training at TCU with the TBRI program years ago completely changed his life. And he talks about the changes that made in his own life with his own parenting, but specifically today, he talks through what it looked like to be in the juvenile justice system and using TBRI principles and what he found. And I'll play a little bit of a spoiler out. I'll play a little bit of a spoiler here and just say what he found was that the TBRI principles and working to build strong, connected relationships with the people that he had, the kids he had in his care, was wildly effective. And if you've been around TBRI, you've been around Empowered to Connect for any amount of time, and you have yourself been implementing these principles with the kids that you have care for, you will know that's no surprise. And so one reason we wanted to have Troy on today is because a typical criticism of this type of engagement, healing-centered engagement with kids who are in tougher backgrounds specifically, is that it doesn't work. And so this is basically one big episode for us to say, yeah, it does. And so Troy is just one guy, but Troy represents a growing number of people in juvenile justice systems and in the school settings across the country that are starting to adopt TBRI principles and kind of connected attachment-rich principles into their caregiving strategies. And shocker, it's going really well. So we wanted to have him on today. For those of you who work in this setting, you do not want to miss this. Forward this episode on to everybody that you know that works in a setting like Troy's. And also just know, Troy grew up in South Central LA. Troy has a background where he was around gangs constantly growing up. So when he encounters a lot of gang activity and kids connected to gangs in the facilities he works with, he's going to use a lot of the different names of the different gangs or different sects that they are in. And so just know that ahead of time as you're going into this episode. It's so good. You're going to love it. Welcome our guest now, Troy McPeak. Our guest today is Troy McPeak, and Troy is the Associate Director of the Texas Model with the Texas Juvenile Justice Department. And so, Troy, man, thank you so much for being here.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate you being on. Why don't we start there? Will you kind of set the table for us with what your current role is and what you do?
Roger. So my current role as the Associate Director of the Texas Model, right, which the Texas Model is our trauma-informed correctional model. So really what we're doing is unprecedented. We're trying to overhaul, right, the old punitive mind state of what juvenile corrections is supposed to be and adopt and deploy TBRI, basically, is what Texas Model is really deeply rooted in, right? Along with elements of dialectical behavior therapy by Mr. Henry Schmidt and some elements of motivational interviewing. But it's really deeply rooted in TBRI, building healthy relationships with youth to help literally rewire their brain, right? And give them more pro-social skills, right? And learn how to deal with their emotions and traumas that they've, been through, learn how to regulate so that they can be productive in society once they leave our care. So my specific role, as I go around the state, right, relentlessly, and I train as many people that will listen to me. The elements of TBRI, how to connect with kids, how to intentionally connect with kids, how to foster those healthy relationships, how to set solid boundaries, and then I get on the dorms, right, and I run nurture groups, right, and then um, I'll touch on nurture groups a little bit later, but that's
Yeah.
really our proactive strategy that we use to really pour pro-social skills into the kids, right? And
Yeah.
really start to replace some of those maladaptive coping mechanisms that they've adopted over time, right? With,
Yeah.
means to help regulate themselves. But before you can do that, they have to first know how they're feeling, right? And not be shamed for being mad or angry, upset,
Yeah.
or have anxiety, right?
Oh,
But
that's
so what we're
huge.
trying to do is replace those behaviors of punching walls or attacking people, right, with different coping strategies that they can use.
Yeah.
So through connection, like I said, we're really rewiring the brain.
Man, so for those who don't really have a framework for how the juvenile justice system works, how different, how unique is what y'all are doing? Kind of, will you talk about the industry standard for a moment? Like, what is a normal environment when a kid's going into? What age group is this? Like, what is a
Right.
normal environment they're going into when they go to a facility like y'all's?
Right, absolutely. So we can get kids anywhere as young as 12, right, all the way
Wow.
through, 18 before they get aged out of the juvenile system
Okay.
and go into the adult system, right? So even at the county level, now TJJD is kind of the prison for the state of Texas, right? And then you have the county level. So my previous job, right, last year, I was a supervisor in a residential treatment facility called CORE, right? But before it became CORE, when we implemented TBRI, we were the academy, and the academy was a military based boot camp. So we had drill
Okay.
instructors, 20 years, tankers, right? And they came to be punitive, you know what I mean? Came to provide sanctions for the kids. So if a kid would do something as not raise their hand in class, right? Or just ask their neighbor something, you're outside in this 103 Texas degree weather doing push-ups and sit-ups or whatever else for 15 minutes, all
Yeah.
because you failed to, we call it TWOP, right? Talking without permission. So
Mm.
to answer your question, right, the traditional model of corrections has always been very punitive, right? So now what we're doing, we're implementing a trauma informed model and educating staff on what is going on in the brain, right? And so what we do know is that most of our kids can be half of their chronological age, right? Depending on their ACE score, right? Which is adverse childhood
Experiences. Yeah.
experiences, right? So, but all of these factors play a huge role in our development, both physical development, cognitive development. Then you top that with mental health issues, right? So to have that punitive model when this kid has an outburst or whatever, would be restraining and wrestling with this kid all day long, right? So I thank God that we implemented TBRI there because it allowed us another avenue, right, and really help and heal this young man, right? And we're not going to fix, all the kids in a 6 month to a year, right?
Sure.
So it takes time. And like I said, when we're talking about implementing this model right now across the state, I tell the staff all the time, it's a marathon, not a race, right? And just like you and I are having a conversation now, if we develop a friendship, it's going to happen organically over
Right.
time. And the same way with kids, with youth, right? And so me personally, I haven't met too many kids that I am unable to build a healthy relationship with, for
Yeah.
sure. And
Totally.
those relationships last. Like I get, you know now being in my role, I can't necessarily accept them, right? But I get Facebook friend requests and Instagram requests, right? Kids wanting to just DM me, hey, sir, I just want to let you know, man, how much I, love the fact that you were there for me, right?
Yeah,
When I
yeah,
was
yeah.
not even there for myself throughout all these years. And, I respectfully decline a Facebook, request so I don't get
Right.
myself in any kind of scrutiny there. But,
Sure.
I will shoot them a message and tell them I'm going to continue to pray for them. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Because ultimately we are the only ones sometimes who are pouring all of that love into these youth, right?
So I'd love to know. I mean, I feel like you're not the typical figure that you would see touting TBRI in a juvenile
Right,
justice setting, right? Like
right,
you definitely fit the stereotype of ex-football player. You're a big
right,
guy, like commanding presence. Like you can see why you would get hired to work in that setting is because
right,
they would say like, oh, this guy, he's going to have total control over the kids, right?
right.
So will you tell us about your story growing up and kind of what, where you from and what's made you who you are?
Right, Roger. So I grew up in Southern California, right outside of my dad owned a business in South Central LA. Um, we were in West Covina, which is LA County
Okay.
first, right? But when gangs and drugs and hit LA real heavy, right? The crack epidemic,
Yeah.
he moved us further east into Riverside, right? So I grew up in Riverside County in the Inland Empire. But part of that migration in the mid '80s, right, of people moving from LA, it just the whole environment, right, changed, right?
Yeah.
So really all of Southern California is just, infested with gangs and everything else, right? So I was lucky and fortunate enough to have um, football as kind of my first love and passion, and it kept me enough on the beaded path, right,
Mm-hmm.
to not stray too far away. Now, I'm not going to say I was perfect, JD, for by all means, because as my dad was running his business, one thing he told me is, it's my job to protect my sister and my mom, right? So we are grown, you're right, we're raised, you can call it, back to like Pavlov conditioned responses, right? If you come at me, right, I'm going to
Yeah.
hit you with a level of aggression that you're not ready for,
Right.
right? And
Right.
I actually have a letter in my backpack from one of my best friend we were talking about that I went to college and played ball with. His older brother actually killed somebody, right? But it's
Wow.
just that same mentality. Some people tried to like, rob him. He pulled out a gun, boom. So I could have easily been in that same situation,
Yeah. Yeah.
So just, but at the same time, it's just a different lifestyle in Southern California. So I really had a passion, right? So outside of playing football, when I would come home in the summer times, I would work in like group home settings, right? With a lot of kids from Kern County, LA County, Riverside, San Bernardino counties, and most of them, right? 90% of them were involved in the gang to some degree, right? So when I was able to bring a youth from East Side Rivas, right, and a kid from 1200 block together who are typically mortal enemies, right, based on the hood dynamics,
Right.
right, I knew I had a gift, right,
And what
because they
was your
were able.
motivation for that? What would lead you to do that as just a college kid who's, you know,
My friend's mom owned, well, she was the administrator of a group home, right, and
uh,
I was thinking this could be cool to kind of work with kids. And I didn't necessarily think I would make a career of it. I thought I was going to the NFL like everybody else,
mhm.
right? But
Yep.
um I really, after that moment, I was kind of like, a gut punch from God and saying you got a call and then a gift to be able to do this, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm gonna touch on TBRI a little bit since I brought God into it, right? Because I really feel like, so like you say, I'm not your typical person. I didn't grow up like talking about feelings and stuff like that,
Right.
right? And a lot of people think that's what TBRI is all about, right?
Sure.
And I tell staff all the time, the greatest gift we can give our kids under our care is the ability to regulate themselves, period, at its core, right? And through the only way we could do that is by building a connection. And then there's all kind of strategies that go along with that, right? But at its core, it's hard, even for a kid, even for some of our worst kids, it's hard for a kid to want to do harm to you, right? If they genuinely feel like you care about them. And that's what
Yeah.
I found as early as 2001,
Okay.
working with that East Side Levi, right, and that 1200 block Crip kid, right, who are
Yeah.
mortal enemies, and they found commonalities and were in tears, talking about, man, ain't nobody ever told us stuff like this, right?
Wow.
But just pouring that love into them because I genuinely want to see you not become a statistic, right, and stay alive.
So
and out of the judicial system.
yeah.
So
So that's your starting point for it. And then how did you get connected in Texas?
right.
And tell me about that.
So in 2007, I'd have never came to Texas. I'm a Cali boy true and through, right? I was out there riding motorcycles 190 miles an hour and living in the fast lane, right? After football. But my mom had got remarried and moved out here to Austin, Texas.
Okay.
And so shortly after that, that was in '04 and '06, she got diagnosed with epilepsy, right? And needed to
Wow.
have brain surgery. And she actually almost died. She suffers from sudden death seizures, grand mal
Wow.
partial seizures. So I me and my wife had, I told her basically we're moving to Texas, right? So I came out here. The plan was I'm gonna come out here, get the job, get our apartment squared away because we're not gonna move in with my mama. That's not happening, right? But so came out here, got the apartment squared away. 3 months later, moved my family out here, and that's when I got my job at Williamson County. This was 2007, right?
Okay.
And so again, we were the academy, right? So I was classified as an academy officer, working deep nights, right? But I still always had that, that compassion and
Kind of
for
relational
whatever reason,
component.
right?
Yeah.
That relational component, right? And the fact that I'm from California, right? LA, all the kids were always kind of drawn to that,
Yeah.
especially the kids that are from out here in Austin. And, for the life of me, I would see kids that are claiming Hoover Crip or, you know, 60 Crip and or GDs, right? And all of
Right.
these are imported gangs. Like you got Chicago-based gangs, LA-based gangs. So for a while, it took me a while to understand like the dynamic of Central Texas and the gang culture, right? But for whatever reason, they were drawn to me and my stories and all of
Yeah.
that good stuff. So I was always able to build that really good connection relatively fast and easy. Plus, at the time I wasn't 290 pounds, so I could almost dunk on them, right? But we right. So, but
Yeah.
then so fast forward, right? We were the academy, 2015, right? So this is kind of my introduction to TBRI, right? Um, I was basically voluntold, right, because of my ability to connect with kids. Our administration told me that I was going to this week-long training in Austin called TBRI, right, and to become a practitioner. So I was like, okay, cool. So a week vacation away from work,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
But so I hit that practitioner training, and JD, I tell you, it changed my life,
Yeah.
right? Darren Jones got up there and talked. Dr. Cross got up there and talked, right? Molly, now Davison got up there and talked, and I felt like they were talking to me. You know what I mean? As far as
Yeah.
that human relational piece, right? And really pouring your heart into what we do and serving the kids, right? And then I was like, I am TBRI. That's how I felt, right? But now you guys have just given me a language to go with, my way of, caring for kids. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
With setting boundaries and, you know, the life values terms that they use were a little bit different because I have a little bit more hood element to me, right? Coming
Yeah.
from where I come from, so my language is a little different when I'm relating to the kids, but so anyway, we were then charged with training all of our staff at Williamson County, right? As we were combining three programs into one, right? And now we called it CORE. I think the acronym is Connect, Overcome, Restore, and Empower.
Okay.
Ooh, look, I ain't been there in a year and I still remember it, right?
Nice.
Right. But we implemented TBRI and we successfully changed the dynamic of that of the environment. And what we saw in that first year, I think our facility administrator ran some numbers and we had like an 83 or 86% reduction in suicide ideation and
Wow.
attempts, right? Our use of force, meaning our restraints and all of that, went down drastically, right? Um, and that was because of the relationship piece. We
Yeah.
were no longer telling kids, look, if you don't get up out of that chair and move to the one right next to it, I'm gonna pick your little butt up and move you,
Right.
right? Now
Right.
we were providing them with choices, right? And trying to really empower the kids. And also at the core, right, I tell you about, being able to regulate, right? Help the kids self-regulate. And really what we're also trying to accomplish is having the kids have that autonomy and be able to really learn how to negotiate their needs to get their needs met. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah.
Without having to act out or, whatever behavior that we see. You know what I mean? Whether it's throwing a temper tantrum, throwing a chair, trying to attack a staff with a sock full of dominoes, whatever that
Yeah.
function of that behavior is, right? Learning how to properly use a voice to get their needs met.
So what is it? What is an average length of stay that a kid might be sentenced to when they get sent out into the system?
Right. So that could depend. So for Williamson County Core, typical length of stay will be about 6 months. So they come into the detention center, right, awaiting court. And once they go to court, if the judge hits the gavel and says you're going to core, which is just on the other side of the building, right, it could be 6 months to, I've actually seen a kid in there a year and a half. No
Okay.
fault of himself, but he was abandoned by his mother, right, who moved off to New York and nobody can get in touch with her. So
Wow.
until we were able to, and he was a good kid, man. He just made a mistake, you know what I mean? And then
Yeah.
but just no support. And his mother was his only family member that we had a record of, right? And she went to New York and didn't want nothing to do with him. So
Oh,
he ended
that's
up having to
tough.
stay with us. Now he successfully completed the program because he was so witty and smart, right?
Yeah.
And he was just a really good kid. Yes, sir, no, ma'am, right? I mean, anything you ask him to do, he was willing to do it, right? Good in school. Like I said, he just made a mistake. So he was really probably done with our program in 4 to 5 months, right? But he had to stay an additional year
Yeah.
until ultimately his mentor was able to adopt him. And then he was
Wow.
able to go to regular. This was the first time I seen a kid that was in our residential facility actually have daily furloughs to go to high school that was down the street, right?
That's
Because
crazy.
of so that just speaks to his character a little bit, right? But and then it also kind of illustrates some of the circumstances these kids are faced with,
Yeah.
right? Imagine that overwhelming feeling of abandonment, right? And for me, that would turn into resentment. And for me at that age, that would turn into anger and
Right.
rage, right?
Right.
And so the behavior, right? That spawns from that, it for me was aggression, right? But for him, it was a little bit different. He would shut down and get really depressed and things
Yeah.
like that. So, when you're looking at some of the causes, right? What are the root issues behind this kid's behavior, right? And how can we help this young man or young woman, right, really deal with that? You know what I mean? That's
Yeah.
kind of the meat and potatoes.
Yeah. So I'm wondering about this first stint of kids that had academy time and core time because there had to have been kids that overlapped, right?
Right. Yes,
And
sir. It's
and
interesting
it,
you say that.
tell me about those. Tell me about that first group and what I mean. How many socks full of dominoes did y'all encounter in that first week?
Right,
Like,
right. So we had some kids, right, that went from wearing BDU uniforms, right, the
mhm,
military uniforms, to all of a sudden they were in, khaki detention style pants and a polo shirt, right? And
right.
we were no longer trying to be punitive. So here's the interesting thing about implementing TBRI, and I'm fortunate enough to serve as a mentor with TCU, and this is kind of one of the underlying themes, right, and preconceived notions is once you implement TBRI, right, all the staff feel like, oh, there's no more accountability, and they throw their hands up. So I'll be honest, it was a whirlwind, right? And I was
Wow.
running around like a chicken with my head cut off, putting out fires constantly all over the place, right? Because staff become more permissive. Now you have staff that were very good at being drills, right? That
Right.
were very, very, very good at doing that, right? So now what they're hearing is their message was, oh, we're just supposed to let kids do whatever the hell they want, right? And that's not
Yeah.
the case. TBRI doesn't
Right.
teach us that. So those kids that overlapped, right? Some of them I can remember one, vividly, right? He was like, "Oh man, FD sir, I get mad. I want to go do push-ups, right?" So he had been with us for 5 months, and then we switch over to not using, those punitive means of behavior modification, but
Right.
offering them choices and compromises to where he can comply. And he's like, "No, f that, f your choices, right?" So, but not to me, but to staff that he had really good
Right.
relationships with, we could talk it out or whatever,
Yeah.
right? But this is also a very volatile, very violent young man that put his forehead through a double pane glass window, right? Because he became dysregulated. So at the end, right, towards the end, I would say his last 2 months, right, that's just one of probably 10 incidents of him punching walls or kicking a hole in a wall or something crazy like that, right? At the end, he was able to tell staff, now not in the best way, right? But sir,
Yeah.
you're triggering me, sir. Let me calm down,
Yeah.
right?
Which is
So
huge.
you
That
start
is
to see,
huge.
right, right, and part of for a kid to be able to tell you that you're triggering him, right?
Yeah.
Even though some people might feel offended by that, at the end of the day, you have a kid that is learning how to recognize how he feels and then trying to ask for that space or appropriate means to calm himself down so he doesn't put his forehead through a double
That's
pane
right.
glass, right? Or his fist through your face or whatever it might
Right.
be, which you just said it, JD, is huge, right?
Well, and because at the end of the day, the goal is not for him to be able to just say that you're triggering him, but
Right,
that shows a step in progress
right,
to be able to self-regulate. Because in
right,
order to do that, you have to be able to recognize that
right,
dysregulation coming, right? So that
for sure.
I wonder about kids who are now coming in and you're seeing them come straight into a system that is empathetic, relationally based, and now going through. What are some of the things that you guys are seeing come of the fruit of this work now coming out, and is that being noticed by other systems around the country?
Oh, yes, sir. So juvenile justice is taking off, right? So, like I said, I'm fortunate enough to get to travel with TCU, whether it's to New Orleans or Oklahoma City was the last practitioner training we just did. So I serve as a mentor, and what we're seeing is that juvenile services, right, is really taking off and wanting to adopt and implement TBRI as their model, right? Because everybody has seen Williamson County and what they did. So now we're doing it at the state level, right? And so all the other counties, not all of them, but a lot of counties across the state are now looking at TJJD, right? Like Harris County, I've done some work down there with training a few facilities down there, right? So a lot of people want to adopt this model and want to implement TBRI because of what they see. It's really the right thing to do, right? If we're really trying to serve our community, right, and really trying to serve our kids, there's no better way to be able to do that than to help kids heal so that they're not, you know, still partaking in these criminal activities when they get out of here, right? Because at the end of the day, JD, this is where the resilient piece comes in, right? Through
Yeah.
our connection with kids, right, and us teaching them how to self-regulate. First, understand how they feel, and then how to regulate, right? That is the resilience that they're gonna need to cope with Third Ward Houston when they get back down there, right? Or
Right.
whatever respective environment that they're going back to. A mother that might be absent because she's working two jobs, and now the hood is coming and want you to start slanging weed or whatever or drugs for
Right.
them, right? Giving kids the ability to just take a minute, pause, and think, right? Just
Man.
for a second, and that
Yeah.
could be the world of a difference. That could literally be the difference between life and death. You know what I mean?
Well, I feel like so often for kids who are coming out of poverty kind of centric communities, um, there can be a panic when you are reintroduced to that community with new tools.
Right.
There can be a panic of, okay, maybe these tools aren't working. Maybe this doesn't work in this environment, right? And so maybe I do need to go to the corner to start working or whatever.
Right.
Let's stick on the resilience piece for a second. And I don't know if you've read this article, but there's an article by Dr. Chris White where he talks about attachment and the development of resilience, and basically says, hey, for so long we've been teaching that high structure and that environment is what builds resilience. High structure and discipline builds resilience.
Right.
And what we're finding now, and this article is incredible. We'll link it in the show notes, but it's an article from Chris White. What we're finding now is that attachment and a secure attachment is actually
Right.
the best breeding ground for resilience. And have you
Right.
guys found that to be true in your work?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So that's a huge part of our teaching as well as our attachment styles, right? And so in order to become a practitioner, we had to go through the AAI, the adult attachment interview, right, which was awkward 2-hour conversation with
Sure.
somebody who ultimately told me about myself, which I'm too arrogant, and I basically told her who I am, right? Yeah, I'm secure attached, but I'm dismissive at the same time. So we had fun with our conversation, but it was very interesting, and that's one of the key elements to the trainings of TBRI and the Texas model is that you really, and when I say earlier, I mentioned that it changed my life, and that attachment, learning about my attachment, right? it allowed me to be mindful of what I bring to every interaction, right?
Oh, yeah.
So because how I grew up, like I grew up in a household where my mom said, because I said so, right? There
Right.
was no
Right.
negotiating. There was no, that's why my lips are so big, because I got popped so many times, right? So she
Oh,
wasn't playing that, right? But she was virtually a single mother, right? Who was trying to really
yeah.
put the hammer down and keep me, on a straight and narrow as much as she could, right? So, I find myself like, after taking that training, right, really, because with my older son, I had to apologize to him because I adopted a lot of
Sure.
what my mom was, right? But once I went through that training, I was like, oh my God, I got it wrong. You know what I mean?
Wow.
So now, like, it's made me a better husband, a better father, a better servant to the youth, right? A better trainer, right? And a lot of that is understanding my attachment, and then understanding too, right? I think we're 80% likely to be, the attachment of our primary caregiver, right? That same
Right.
attachment style. But the gold standard, like you say, is basically secure attachment, right? What we do know is that through connection, right, we can have earned secure attachment, right?
Yeah.
So just because a kid might have grew up in a disorganized, caregiver style, right, or a dismissive caregiver style, ultimately through connection with somebody, right, and building that resilience and deploying all the strategies we use to intentionally connect and pour all the pro-social skills, a kid can have what we call earned security, right? To
Yeah.
where, yeah.
Yeah.
So
So, okay, I'm thinking about, there's a lot of our listeners work in maybe some nonprofit kind of youth centered organizations where it might be kids who are in the juvenile justice system. It might be kids who are in sports recreation ministries and stuff like that, or in different programs where they're in an early intervention type. If you were speaking to those who are working in those environments and you're saying, I want to give you, the self work that has helped me the most. Are there a few things that you realized through that attachment interview and starting to realize these things helped me to feel like I had what it took to be able to give myself away? Are there any things that you would say, here's the first few steps you want to take to be able to offer what you need to these kids?
right. So I think attachment would be huge, right? Understanding your own attachment style. And again, that allows you to be mindful of your own triggers, right? What sets you off, right? And then understanding ways that you can use, right, for self-care, right? And that ultimately, if you're bringing your baggage into the workplace, no matter who you serve, right, it's going to be a toxic environment for
Right.
you, for whoever you engage with, right? So understanding your triggers, what you need to do to kind of self-regulate yourself, right? So for me, it's getting in my truck, right? Putting on some Sade or some Maxwell, some slow jams, right? And driving for 2 or 3
Yeah.
hours. Some people go to a bar, some people do other things. I get in my truck and I drive, but it allows me to kind of put everything in perspective, realign my scattered thoughts
So
in my
good.
brain, right? And really just, take that time for myself, right? So that would be the first thing, is make sure, you're doing what you need to do as far as self-care is concerned. And then really just understand that you could be, right, because we wear the hat of so many different roles sometimes that we're not even aware of, right? So you ultimately can be that individual in this kid's life, right, that helped change his trajectory, right? And
Yeah.
I've seen that so many times, and I've been told by so many different kids. So I really look at you like a father. When I left Williamson County, they had like a little, celebration deal in the gym, and it was awkward, and they put me, in the center stage kind of deal, right? But some of them kids got up there and were in tears because I was leaving the TJJD, right? And one of them, just exactly what he said. He said, "Sir, I know when I first met you, I cussed you out." Right?
Yeah.
But you never left my side, right? And then he starts getting choked up, and I'm getting a little emotional thinking about it. But he
Man.
says, "You never left my side, and I've never had anybody, you know what I mean, like that. And so for that, I look at you like a father figure." And then he tries to keep talking, but he started crying. All I could do was give him a hug, JD, right? And then he sat
Yeah.
down, right? But he was so distraught that I was leaving, you know what I mean? Because I've seen him at his worst, right? And he was dealing with a lot of heavy baggage. When he first came to us, his grandmother was, dying of stage 4 cancer. They're in a 1 bedroom apartment, low income housing, right? And he was
Wow.
part of our JJAP program. His sister would disappear, you know, on, weeks on end. His mother would disappear weeks on end on meth binges and stuff like that. They would come in and steal his stuff, right? He was part of the Gangster Disciples locally, right? So I mean, he just had so much going on top of his own, you know, mental issues that he had going on. So again, you look at that, right? So how do we best serve this young man, right? It ain't
Yeah.
being punitive and making him do push-ups for not making his bed right, right?
Right.
It's teaching him how to cope with what he's got going
That's right.
on,
That's right.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
shortly after he got arrested and detained, right, and sent to court, his grandmother ended up passing, right? And so, like I told him, right, he really wouldn't open up to anybody, but we had a real good conversation in our visitation room where he kind of fell out crying and all of that good stuff, right? But he really disclosed how he felt, right? And that was a powerful kind of moment for us in building our relationship because I was there with him, right? I went through it. You see this chain, right? So
Yeah.
I talked about me losing my grandfather and walking in on that process, right? And we really just were in the moment and connected, right? But he then allowed me into his space, right? Into
Yeah.
him being able to correct him. So instead of cussing out staff, right, I can tell him, Mark, come here for a minute, right? Let me holler at you before you make a wrong decision. Come here, come walk with me, right? And then so I would start using these different strategies to help him understand when you get frustrated, it's cool, right? The true
Right.
testament of a man is how you deal with frustration, right? Not whether or not we get frustrated. So let me show you how to, deal with it appropriately. We would do push-ups, we would do wall pushes, we would do seat push and pulls, we would do deep breathing, we would just walk and use a lot of profanity sometimes, right? So whatever it took, right? But what he's learning in that process is different ways that he can calm himself, right?
Hmm.
And so I'm sorry, JD. I go off on tangents sometimes because it's just so many different avenues, man. This stuff is just so relevant. But what I know is by doing deep breathing, right, it's manipulating your brain chemistry, right? If I can get
Yep.
you to take 5 or 6 deep breaths, it's releasing the cortisol and all of those good chemicals in your brain to calm your body, right? And so for the aggressive kids like me, I've got scars all over my knuckles from punching walls and punching people growing up. Had I known that I could do push-ups and it chemically does the same exact thing, right? As,
Totally.
as getting into a fight or a restraint, right?
Yeah.
Then, maybe I wouldn't have arthritis now at 39, right?
So I
So,
no, I think the tangents are good because I think what's really helpful is there's two things. So one, for the practitioners, for those who are kind of in that environment, I would imagine that this is a different world for them. Like you're hearing this stuff and thinking, man, there might be a way that I don't have to leave the facility hoarse every day from screaming all day.
right,
Like there might be a way that I can leave without having to, put my hands on a kid every day. Like there might be a way I
right,
can leave without, having the heartbreak of watching somebody get, put in the deepest
right,
level of containment, whatever. And I think for the second thing that's really helpful is for a lot of us, when we're growing up in one specific environment, you tend to view kids in the juvenile justice system as, I'm using air quotes here for those who can't see it, but
badass kids,
bad kids, right?
right,
Yeah, bad kids. And well, these kids, they've got to learn some discipline. This is the problem is
right,
they don't have anybody at home teaching them. So I think it's really helpful for you to be able to break down. Every one of us has a story.
right,
Everybody's got a story, and for the kids who come from the most opportunity sparse environments, you develop those survival tactics because you need to survive. It's not a, not
right,
a it's not a matter of speech. Like that's a literal survival tactic that you've got, and it helps you to survive. And so to learn to put the guard down on those and actually, tap into your emotions and process what's been going on has got to be a terrifying thing for a kid that comes through an
right.
environment like that.
For sure, absolutely. And I think as far as helping, so that's one of the first and biggest hurdles when implementing, a trauma informed model, right? Is helping staff switch that lens from looking at kids as being willfully disobedient. They just
Yeah,
need structure, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
and somebody need to show them some act right, to
yeah.
understanding the iceberg, right? And by the iceberg, I mean, the trauma lens, right? Looking through a different lens. So not being willfully disobedient, but understanding that their behaviors is a manifestation of the trauma that they've been through in their past, right? So they're their survival brain is activated constantly, right? Which
Right.
I'm referring to the amygdala, right? So
Yep.
kids that live in a hyper state of arousal constantly, right? And we know through science that that's toxic to the body, right? It releases those stress chemicals in your bloodstream constantly, and it's ultimately my colleague, right, that I work with, he tells a really powerful story about becoming a type 1 diabetic at the height of his kind of trauma that he was beat the crap out of constantly, right? He scores
Man.
like an 8 out of 10 on the ACEs, right? And
Wow. Wow.
so
Wow.
when we're training our staff, right, to hear that testimony, it gives me the chills every time, right? Because there's no other medical, scientific explanation on why he became a diabetic, right? Other than that toxic stress that he was constantly under day in and day out. And at the height of all that abuse, he was then diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And now it really altered his life, and he's got to wear a pump and the whole nine, right? So
Yeah.
again, that hurdle sometimes can feel like a mountain because people are just so stuck in a traditional, these are bad kids and they need to be punished. The judge has already punished them. She's already hit the gavel. So to touch back on your question you asked a while ago, I kind of hit on a county level, but for the state level, right, TJJD, we might have kids here from a year, right, that are to kids that are looking at 35 years determining sentences, right? So kids that have committed, murder, right? We had a 12-year-old that shot his brother in the chest, right? And so he's looking at, 35 years on a determinate sentence, and
Wow.
I don't know the whole intricacies of his particular case, but I just
Sure.
thought it was so crazy that a 12-year-old could pick up a gun and shoot his sibling. So
Man.
yeah, we're dealing with some really hard cases, but a lot of times, even with some kids that have committed some of the most heinous acts, right? I get on the dorms and I talk to them. They ain't no different from you. They ain't no different
100%.
from me,
Yes, that's
right?
right. That's right.
They acted on an emotion,
Mhm.
JD, and that's what it comes down to. How can we get kids not to act on that emotion, not to be so impulsive, right? And
Yeah.
there's very intentional ways we go about doing that, but at the foundation, it's all about connection because a kid ain't going, you know, he's not going to listen to you if he's not connected with you,
That's
right?
right. That's right. Man, number one, I could talk about this all day.
You and
Number
me too,
two, you and I both have other stuff we got to get going on
right?
today. So why don't we kind of close with this? We talked about sort of the self work that would be needed on the front end of just introducing yourself to this if you were in this field. So for those who are in this field, or even for those who are who might feel like you're describing their kids at home with these behaviors and stuff, why don't you talk through maybe some of the most introductory, elementary tools that we've got for helping when a kid is off the rails, lids flipped, amygdala is up, they're in their survival response, fight, flight, or
Right.
freeze. Like when they're there, what are some of those introductory tools that you're teaching your team to use to help bring
Right.
regulation?
Right. So at the root of it, I always when the kid's lid is flipped, right, we know that they can only hear 3 to 5 words, right? So this isn't the time to hit them with a long lecture, right? The grandparent speech, because they're not going to
Man,
hear or retain any of it anyway, right? So I always like for me, I call it, my Jedi mind trick, right? I'm trying to distract the kid from his distraction, his or her distraction, whatever they're fixated on, right? So if I'm in this classroom setting and I'm mad at this kid or the teacher, I want to remove them from that situation, right? Not by force, but hopefully I've got enough money in the bank that when I show up on a scene, right, and I could say, young lady or young man, let me get 2 minutes, right? And we can go on a walk. And I give them that platform to vent, get it out, right? And then we can, you know, go on to different strategies. So for some young men, it might be push-ups, right, to
yep.
help calm them down so they don't punch anything or entice a restraint. I had another young man that was kind of on the spectrum of autism. I had little bubbles, right? And I don't know why. One day he was in the middle of restraint. I blew some bubbles, and literally
Wow.
the kid looked up and seen the bubbles flying. told staff, let me effing go, right? And started popping bubbles. And so then I'm like, here, you want to try? Right. And so that was just kind of an outside of the box way
Yeah.
to distract him from his distraction, right? And so when I give him the stick of the bubbles and now he blows a couple, and then I say, hey, why don't you try taking a deeper breath and then blow, right? So in my mind, I know I'm manipulating this kid's brain chemistry, right, to calm
Yep.
his body. But
Yeah.
for him, he's just blowing bubbles, right? And so that became like an everyday tool that we use. And like I had a stockpile of the little 99-cent store
Keeping him in
bubbles, right?
business.
Because man, I knew when he went off, right? And even our FA, one time we ran to a code 99, right? And I said, oh, shoot, I left my bubbles, right? He said, where are they? I said, sir, go get them in there in my office desk drawer. And he comes and then we're actively restraining this young man because he was trying to throw like the teacher's desk, or not the desk, but the computer off the desk, right?
Okay.
And so,
Yeah.
he's acting out. He's in one of his phases that is almost uncontrollable to him, right? He's on the spectrum. This kid
Yeah.
is very low functioning, right? So we're in the middle of a restraint, and then my FA says, "What do you want me to do?" I said, "Blow the bubbles,"
Release the bubbles.
and almost instantly, boom! It disarmed that fear response that he was,
Yeah.
activated. Right, he was no longer in that survival brain, and you can see that prefrontal cortex, come back. So again, it's all going to be predicated on your relationship with the kid, right, and what you've introduced to him and what works to him or her, right? I had another kid, that autistic schizophrenic kid, right? We would work out, right? He found
Huh.
he saw, so I coach my son's football team, right? And he
Yeah.
saw tackling dummies in the back seat, right? So when he got dysregulated, and this only happened by chance because I was able to get him out of that environment, right, where he
Yeah.
was dysregulated, getting attacked by other kids and attacking other kids, came outside and let him vent for a while. He looked in the back of my truck, asked what that is, boom, and I got him, right?
Wow. That's
that
awesome.
was that was the tool that I was able to use. So I told him after a long conversation about me being a D coordinator and the 3 Ds of defense and him needing to be disciplined, right? If he wanted to be on my team, right? So we made a pact that whenever he got frustrated or angry, right, we would do a sensory break, right? We would
Uh-huh.
remove him from the classroom or whatever part of programming, go outside, and I would allow him to do like different workouts, right? He thought he was training for the NFL combine, but I know what's going on neurochemically in his brain is that through this proprioceptive input, right, it's calming his body and it's getting him to a point to where he'll be able to function the rest of the day, right? So again, that's the resilient piece, right? That's the tools that we're teaching these kids that they can utilize in order to help them calm down. But it's all predicated on that relationship, right?
Yeah. Any last thoughts on building resiliency and the kind of some of the tools that you guys might be using aside from those first steps? But what are you guys seeing in terms of effectiveness with building resiliency over time in your facilities?
So JD, you just opened up the can of worms for another hour's worth of conversation as far as some of the tools that we're using.
Okay.
So one of our proactive tools is nurture groups, right? And then through nurture groups, we'll purposely dysregulate the youth through an activity, right? Get their engine on red, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Then we'll do an engine check-in, and then we'll intentionally teach them a strategy to calm down, whether that's seat push and pulls, wall pushes, right? Something proprioceptive or some deep breathing, right? And so you repeat that over and over and over again, right? So that's building that self-awareness, right? That kind of emotional wherewithal to recognize where I am on this. We have red, green, and blue, right? Kind of our engine plate, right? So
Sure.
understanding where I am on this engine plate and then being able to regulate myself for whatever activity we're getting ready to do, right? So if
Yeah.
I don't want to be in the red, right, if I'm sitting in class, I need to learn how to calm myself down. Nor do I want to be in the blue, right, if I'm getting ready for a football game. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's my job to get my team in the red and get ready to go obliterate this other squad over here, right?
Yeah.
So that's one of the proactive tools we use. And then in TJJD, we've implemented a MAPS room. It's called Making a Plan for Success. So if a kid is dysregulated in the classroom, they can go into the MAPS room. And in there's proprioceptive stations, there's, journaling, there's deep breathing stations, so on and so forth. On the dorms, we have what you call common areas, right? So if a kid gets dysregulated, he can request to go to the common area. And there we have fidgets and weighted blankets, weighted animals, right? Rocking chairs, just different tools. We also have as kind of a separate hallway for our security unit, a regulation zone, right? So we're doing everything that we can, right, to help kids not have to go and get locked up to security, right? If they need
Yeah.
to get off the dorm,
Yeah.
RSU unit could come to the dorm and take them to the regulation zone, right?
Yeah.
So it's just that it's an area for you to be able to regulate, right? And so hopefully our staff, our development coaches that are assigned to that particular unit, right, have the knowledge and the wherewithal to help whichever kids come in there, right? So effectiveness, I think, is very effective, and I wish we would have had these tools at Williamson County, to be honest, right? We were just kind of swinging in the dark a lot of times, right? And trying to
Yeah.
figure things out as we grew, you know what I mean, with our program. But we were very effective in changing the culture, right? And like I said, I've embraced moms that are crying because they've seen tremendous growth in their kids when they come home on furlough. Now all of a sudden they want to help around chores and, are able to accept no, right? Just as small as that sounds,
Huge.
right? Able
Yes.
to accept
Yeah.
no without throwing a big temper tantrum, right?
Yeah.
I've embraced kids that, didn't have any support at home, right? But you continue to work with them. I got, one of those instant messengers I was talking about was from a young man that had no support. So he turned to the streets, big old kid too, a good 6'2", 245, like, but he's a
Man.
blood out here and really involved in the streets. But at the end of the day, he's got new motivation, right? He showed me a
Right.
picture of his son, right?
Wow.
And he thanked me for showing him the ways of being a real man, right? And not you know, a street dude, right? So I
Powerful.
would end by telling everybody, you know what I mean? One, you can't take anybody on a journey that you haven't been on or willing to go on yourself, right?
Ooh, say that again.
Right. Well, that's
Man.
not mine. That comes from Dr. Cross, right? So I plagiarize Dr. Cross right now. But
Sure.
you cannot take anybody on a journey, right, that you have not been on or willing to go on yourself, right?
Yeah.
And then the second thing is, like I said earlier, we wear the hats of so many different roles, right? And it could be you that makes a difference in the kid's life, right? So if not you, then who's it going to be? All
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
That's powerful stuff.
Troy, it is powerful stuff, man. I cannot thank you enough for your time. And I
Yes,
hope you
sir. I
know that
appreciate you.
coming on today ropes you into being a recurring guest on the show
Oh,
over time.
absolutely.
So,
Anytime. There's so many gaps and holes that I feel like, I left out here and there. But like you said, I could talk to you for 5-6 hours about this
sure.
easy, right? And just how the impact that it's had on my personal life, my family's life, the kids in the jail, you know what I mean? I've got 12 years worth of stories of being inside of secure facilities, right, that I can share with you,
Well,
So
I know there's going to be probably a flood of those who reach out to you in the aftermath of this saying, hey, I need to do some time with you on the phone coming up soon.
right.
Well, man, yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you again for your time, and we'll talk to you soon.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All
You
right.
take care.
Man, big thanks to Troy McPeak for coming on the show today. And I just keep thinking about what he said. The greatest gift we can give the kids we care for is the ability to self-regulate. And just let that sink in for a second. I know that for me, our conversation today was very encouraging and inspiring. And it gives me some juice, I think, to be able to go tackle the second half of a day of parenting during a pandemic with 4 kids, all doing virtual school while my wife and I try to work from home. So yeah, you can pray for us. We are, as I'm sure you are too, we're just in it, man. Isn't this thing hard right now? Isn't this a strange time in life? Speaking of that, we are hoping to talk to some of our parent trainers coming up in the future in a roundtable discussion about parenting during the pandemic and parenting during a race crisis and what are we seeing that's working? What are some practices and some tools that maybe you hadn't thought of or innovations that have helped around the house during this time? And so, those helps can't be hiring you babysitters. We can't do that for you, obviously. But what we would love to do is to hear other ideas that you've got. What would be helpful for you? What would you want to know in future episodes? Are there guests that you'd want us to have on, or topics that you specifically would like to see us cover? Let us know. You can go to empoweredtoconnect.org and click on the podcast page. And then on that page, there's a feedback form. We'd love to know your thoughts on today's episode, any of the episodes recently, or what you'd like to hear from us in the future. As always, if you're enjoying the show, we hope that you will go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review us, and review it 5 stars. It does help our show to get listed on some parenting charts that will help those who are looking for this type of content to be able to find it. And then, of course, if you want to share it with a friend, we would greatly appreciate it. And so we hope that you will do that. Listen, for Kyle Wright, our engineer, and for Tad Jewett, our artist musician, and for Troy McPeak, Mo Ottinger, and Tana Ottinger, I'm JD Wilson, and this has been another episode of the Empowered to Connect podcast. We will see you next week.